At the commencement of the Second World War, Hermann Göring presented himself to the German populace as a figure embodying both assurance and pomposity. In his capacity as commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, he confidently asserted that German territories would remain impervious to enemy aerial assaults, affirming the security of German airspace under his command and predicting the dominance of the Third Reich's air forces throughout Europe. Initially, his declarations held substantial influence, primarily due to the Luftwaffe's prior demonstration of formidable capabilities through the Blitzkrieg operations conducted in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Göring firmly maintained the conviction that Germany had already established the most formidable air force globally, asserting that no industrial nation situated across the Atlantic could ever attain parity. He ridiculed American aviation endeavors, characterizing them as amateurish and lagging in technological advancement, citing their reliance on outdated biplanes and training aircraft that lacked the sophistication necessary to compete with German Messerschmitts or Junkers. Göring's oversight lay in his neglect to acknowledge America's extensive industrial and economic capabilities. In 1939, while the Luftwaffe boasted an inventory comprising thousands of operational combat aircraft, the United States Army Air Corps was comparatively small and dispersed, possessing fewer than 2,500 aircraft, with only a small percentage suitable for combat missions. In Göring's assessment, it seemed preposterous that such a nation could pose any aerial threat to the Reich. He viewed America as affluent but feeble, possessing industrial capacity, yet lacking the organizational resolve required to convert its manufacturing infrastructure into the production of military armaments. This dismissive demeanor extended even to his private dialogues with Hitler and other prominent Nazi figures, where he derided American engineers for prioritizing consumer conveniences such as refrigerators, automobiles, and radios over the design and construction of potent combat aircraft. Indeed, his viewpoint mirrored a more widespread underestimation prevalent among the Nazi leadership. Hitler and Göring shared a deeply ingrained conviction that democratic nations were fundamentally incapable of engaging in total warfare. They presumed that industrial prowess alone could not be transformed into combat effectiveness without the imposition of authoritarian control. This flawed assumption obscured their perception of the capabilities America was poised to unleash. Even as Europe experienced escalating conflict, American industries were discreetly establishing the foundations for large-scale mobilization. By 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt had initiated the Arsenal of Democracy initiative, calling upon the nation to gear up for wartime production on an unprecedented scale. Nonetheless, Göring's pronouncements exuded unwavering conviction. Following the capitulation of France, he assured the German people that no air force worldwide could rival the Luftwaffe's capabilities. Throughout the Battle of Britain, despite incurring mounting losses, he consistently reassured Hitler that German aircraft production surpassed that of Britain, and that American intervention in Europe would not occur in time to alter the war's trajectory. In his assessment, the Atlantic Ocean served as an insurmountable obstacle, preventing American bombers from reaching European airspace, and he believed that U.S. pilots would never attempt to penetrate contested skies defended by German fighter squadrons. This arrogance was bolstered by initial Nazi intelligence reports, which significantly underestimated the advancements achieved by America in aviation technology. German agents conveyed that the U.S. lacked modern combat aircraft, relied on obsolete designs, and possessed virtually no strategic framework for conducting long-range bombing operations. Göring embraced these reports as they reinforced his preconceived notions. He remained unaware that within a relatively short span, American engineers and factory workers would produce such a huge number of bombers and fighter planes that even the most accomplished pilots of the Luftwaffe would be overwhelmed by their sheer numbers. Göring's excessive self-assurance also stemmed from his personal experiences. As a highly decorated fighter pilot in World War I, he regarded himself as the foremost expert in aerial warfare. He believed that no foreigner, especially anyone from the United States, could possibly possess a better understanding of air combat than the Germans who had been the first to develop it. This feeling of superiority impaired his ability to make sound judgments, preventing him from recognizing the significant threat posed by America's industrial capabilities. However, beneath the surface, problems were already beginning to emerge. As early as 1941, when reports surfaced about new American bomber designs undergoing testing, several Luftwaffe officers cautioned Göring that the United States might be preparing to introduce something truly groundbreaking. He disregarded these warnings, asserting that Germany's sophisticated technology, including the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Focke-Wulf 190, and its powerful flak defenses, would consistently maintain a decisive advantage. What he failed to anticipate was that, while Germany was focusing on smaller-scale innovations, America was gearing up to mass-produce warplanes on an unprecedented industrial scale that would fundamentally change the nature of air warfare. In those early years, many in Germany found Göring's confidence and dismissive attitude to be justified, but his laughter would soon turn into disappointment and bitterness, as he came to the realization that America's supposedly inexperienced air force would evolve into an unstoppable force that even he would eventually be compelled to acknowledge. When the United States officially entered the conflict following the attack on Pearl Harbor, its transition from a peaceful economy to a wartime manufacturing powerhouse was unlike anything the world had previously witnessed. Almost instantly, industries that had previously specialized in producing automobiles, washing machines, and typewriters received orders to convert their facilities for the production of combat aircraft. The Ford Motor Company's expansive Willower Run plant in Michigan became the most iconic representation of this transformation, specifically designed to mass-produce B-24 Liberator bombers using assembly line techniques. While Germany depended on highly skilled artisans and smaller workshops, America concentrated on achieving maximum volume and efficiency. At its peak production level, Willow Run was completing a new bomber every 63 minutes, an astounding output rate that dwarfed anything the Luftwaffe could hope to achieve. Other major industrial firms also joined the effort. Douglas, Lockheed, and Boeing became well-known names for their production of bombers and fighter planes. Factories that had once manufactured refrigerators were now producing aluminum fuselages. Plants that produced sewing machines began manufacturing precision ball bearings, and automobile factories were producing aircraft engines instead of car chassis. The integration of civilian industry into the war effort resulted in a surge of production that astonished even America's allies. In 1940, the United States produced fewer than 6,000 aircraft. By 1944, that number had risen to nearly 100,000 per year, a figure so immense that even Germany's most optimistic production planners could not comprehend it. This rapid industrial mobilization was not a coincidence. It was carefully planned and coordinated by government organizations such as the War Production Board, which managed contracts, raw materials, and logistics on a nationwide basis. Entire cities were transformed and reoriented around the production of aircraft. Women joined the labor force in previously unseen quantities, becoming the well-known Rosie the Riveters, who carried out lengthy work periods putting together wings and securing metal sheets on combat aircraft. It seemed, for the first time ever in the United States, that everyone was directly supporting the war. Whether by working in manufacturing plants, purchasing government war bonds, or conserving supplies for military applications. Initially, Göring and the Nazi command disregarded these occurrences, firmly stating that America's assets would be squandered because of wastefulness. But reports arrived gradually from German Secret Service members in South America and neutral countries. American manufacturing wasn't just expanding. Its rate of growth was surpassing expectations. New training centers were appearing swiftly all over the nation, where a multitude of pilots were being prepared for warfare. Fields that were initially used for dusting crops were changed into airfields, for military students to gain knowledge of direction finding and bombing methods. By 1942, the United States Army Air Forces had developed into a contemporary combat division, and the arrival of new aircraft was consistent. The enormity of this activation had a significant impact on the battlefield. Whereas the Luftwaffe was required to carefully allocate its limited resources, America started providing supplies not only to its own military, but also to its allies. British Royal Air Force units operated American-made bombers and fighter planes, and the Soviet Union obtained a multitude of airplanes through the Lend-Lease program. Every airplane manufactured in Detroit or Seattle signified an additional German soldier encountering devastation on the battle lines. The contrast that existed between German and American production mindsets was noticeable. German factories emphasized superior quality and cutting-edge engineering, but found it hard to sustain the high demand, typically producing less than 100 airplanes of a certain design each month. American factories emphasized standardization and interchangeable components, implying repairs and replacements were quick and economical. This variance in method meant that even when Luftwaffe pilots attained elevated numbers of enemy planes destroyed, American replacement aircraft arrived in formations that the Germans just couldn't equal. By 1943, Göring was no longer in a position to disregard the proof. Allied bombing groups increased in dimension with each passing month, and the skies above Germany became darker from the shapes of approaching aircraft. America's industrial surge had transformed the once dismissed U.S. Air Forces into an unstoppable force. The Luftwaffe still possessed proficient ace pilots and impressive aircraft, but their achievements were progressively insignificant. For each bomber destroyed, 2 more moved off the assembly line and took its place. The hubris of dismissing American industry had blinded Göring in the crucial initial years of the conflict. What he formerly made fun of was now developing into the terrible scenario that Germany's war strategists most dreaded: an adversary with the ability to restore its losses indefinitely. While Germany's personal aircraft manufacturing weakened under the force of steady bombing, the American mobilization was no longer simply an economic phenomenon. It was a weapon just as dangerous as any explosive launched from the sky. When American bombers initially went across into German-occupied land, the Luftwaffe's leadership met the attacks with a blend of interest and doubt. The initial missions possessed a limited scope, frequently involving small squadrons of B-17 Flying Fortresses or B-24 Liberators operating from airfields in England. These daylight incursions, which commenced in 1942, were audacious yet fraught with peril. The American forces adopted a strategy centered on pinpoint bombing, intending to hit precise military and manufacturing targets during the day, diverging from the British preference for nighttime area bombing. This choice struck Göring and numerous Luftwaffe commanders as utter foolishness. Their conviction was that dense German anti-aircraft fire and throngs of interceptors would obliterate any squadron rash enough to venture an attack in broad daylight. Initially, events seemed to vindicate their viewpoint. Early sorties targeting sites in France, the Low Countries, and even locations deep within Germany experienced substantial casualties. German fighter planes, such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, efficiently and methodically decimated bomber formations. Göring reveled in these reports, publicly deriding American airmen as both naive and inexperienced. He confidently predicted that, within mere months, the Americans would completely abandon daylight missions, compelled to concede that the Luftwaffe alone could assert true dominion over the skies. However, the Americans remained steadfast. Instead, they learned to adapt. Bomber crews developed innovative formation strategies, maneuvering in closely packed combat boxes where the intersecting arcs of defensive machine gun fire generated a formidable barrier against attackers. Casualties remained elevated, yet the outcomes of the sorties began to manifest. Railroad yards, manufacturing plants, and submarine pens along the Atlantic coastline sustained damage, thus impeding Germany's supply infrastructure and posing a threat to its naval activities. Even seemingly expensive failures had an undeniable psychological effect as American planes reached into German territory. German civilians faced, for the first time since the conflict had broken out, the unsettling reality that their urban centers and industrial complexes were not invulnerable. These incursions highlighted another fact as well. The United States possessed an unparalleled capacity to replace lost aircraft and personnel. A dozen bombers lost on a single mission would have critically weakened most air forces. The United States, however, was able to get replacements ready within a few weeks. Göring, who formerly dismissed American aviation as inconsequential, began receiving intelligence reports detailing the constant stream of reinforcements crossing the Atlantic. While he endeavored to project an image of unwavering confidence in his public addresses, he privately understood that Germany was confronting an adversary whose reserves appeared inexhaustible. As the incursions delved deeper into the Reich, Luftwaffe commanders found themselves obliged to dedicate an increasing number of fighter planes to defend vital industrial areas such as the Ruhr Valley. Aerial engagements grew larger and more intense, with hundreds of German and American aircraft clashing on a daily basis. Despite the impressive scores achieved by German aces, the overall cost was significant. Every interception depleted valuable fuel reserves, caused wear and tear on engines, and consumed the Luftwaffe's rapidly diminishing pool of seasoned pilots. By the close of 1942, the strain was becoming conspicuous. Still, Göring held on to the belief that German air defenses would ultimately prove too formidable for the Americans to bear. He sought to reassure Hitler that mounting losses would erode their resolve, and that the daylight bombing campaign would be unsustainable. However, the first signs of weakness were beginning to surface in this facade. Metropolises such as Bremen and Wilhelmshaven suffered considerable destruction, and attacks aimed at airplane manufacturing plants started to impede production timelines. The previously untouchable German nation was now susceptible to strikes from American aircraft, compelling the German Air Force to assume a defensive role, a circumstance they had not foreseen so prematurely in the war. The unwavering resolve displayed by the Americans was perhaps the most startling facet of the situation. German officials had presupposed that a country of sensitive citizens and entrepreneurs would retreat at the sight of substantial losses, but instead, the raids escalated in intensity, scope, and frequency. Every operation communicated a definite message. The United States had made a commitment to continue the conflict until the destruction of German industry was complete. For Göring, who had so frequently boasted about German superiority, the vision of American bombers traversing German airspace served as the initial foreboding indication that his pledges were untenable. By 1943, the phrase "flying fortresses" was no longer mere propaganda. It morphed into a grim reality for the German Air Force. The B-17s and B-24s that crowded the skies above occupied Europe represented more than just the prowess of American industry. They were also incredibly robust machines. Aircrews brought back bombers riddled with bullet holes, engines aflame, tails almost completely severed. Yet they still managed to struggle their way back to England. This durability, coupled with the increasingly coordinated combat box formations, meant that, even when swarms of German fighter planes launched attacks on the formations, the Americans maintained their course, unleashing a cascade of bombs upon objectives deep within German territory. The approach of precision bombing during daylight hours stirred contention even among America's allies, but it demonstrated its destructive force when implemented on a large scale. Manufacturing sites producing ball bearings in Schweinfurt, submarine docking facilities in Hamburg, and industrial complexes in the Ruhr region became priority targets. The German Air Force's defense infrastructure, once thought to be unbreakable, was pushed to the verge of collapse. German fighter pilots exhibited resolve in combat, but each sortie required increased fuel, more missions, and greater degrees of peril. The fundamental truth was this: America had the capacity to sustain losses of bombers and air crews and swiftly replace them, a feat Germany could not replicate in terms of its pilots or aircraft. One of the standout attributes of this military campaign was the psychological alteration it forced within the German population. German civilians, previously confident in Göring's declarations of an inviolable homeland, now sought shelter as warning sirens blared. Factories maintained round-the-clock production schedules, yet numerous facilities experienced repeated strikes. Workers emerged from shelters to witness mangled steel, shattered windows, and production halts lasting for weeks. For Göring, who had once proclaimed that no bomb would ever strike German soil, the escalating devastation was a source of humiliation. Yet he persisted in speeches, asserting that the German Air Force maintained control of the skies, even as mounting evidence contradicted his claims. The German Air Force's High Command endeavored to adapt to the situation. Newly designed aircraft, such as the Faulaka Wolf 190, underwent modifications to accommodate heavier weaponry for intercepting bombers. Twin-engine aircraft, including the Messerschmitt 110, were equipped with rockets to disrupt American formations. However, every inventive measure encountered the same enduring obstacle: the immense quantity of bombers and their continuous arrival. Göring's military leaders urgently requested more supplies, but the German wartime economy was already overburdened due to fighting across numerous battlefields. Every destroyed bomber was quickly manufactured again, but each fallen German pilot left a void that was hard to fill. The approach used by the Americans was not perfect. The number of planes lost during deep missions, like those targeting Regensburg and Schweinfurt, was incredibly high. Countless airmen never made it back from operations, their aircraft crashing in flames over European lands. Observers in both Washington and London wondered if the human cost was too great. However, what truly set apart the American war effort was their steadfast determination. Despite disastrous missions, they reorganized, educated more air crews, constructed additional aircraft, and took to the skies once more. The underlying message was evident. Germany was unable to sustain a war of depletion against an opponent with seemingly unlimited resources. As 1943 drew to a close, the atmosphere above Germany had noticeably shifted. In place of occasional bombing sorties, there were now immense waves of bomber aircraft appearing consistently week after week. The German population, who had previously placed their faith in their air force, began to distrust Göring's guarantees. Citizens privately speculated that the German Empire was losing its command over the skies, a worry that ate away at public confidence. For Göring, on a personal level, this public failure was deeply humiliating. Once the extravagant commander of the German Air Force, he now faced mounting criticism from Hitler himself, who demanded reasons for why American bombers continued to strike at the core of Germany. The sight of B-17 bombers flying in organized groups became a symbol of the new state of affairs. The German Empire was no longer safe, regardless of Göring's loud claims. His assurance that German skies would be impenetrable had been disproven, replaced by a rising understanding, even among the highest levels of Nazi command. This recognition was that American aerial power was consistently crushing the German Empire into surrender. These airborne fortresses were no longer mere oddities or annoyances. They were a signal of Germany's approaching downfall. The year 1944 represented a critical turning point in the aerial conflict. Up until then, American bombers had been compelled to travel deep within German territory without the protection of long-range fighters, leaving them prone to attacks from hordes of German interceptor planes. Losses were significant, and Göring still held on to the idea that the sheer severity of these defenses would eventually force the United States to decrease the intensity of its aerial attacks. But then a new aircraft emerged that completely changed the situation. This was the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang possessed a streamlined design, high speed, and, most importantly, the ability to accompany bombers for the entire journey from English airfields to the center of Germany and back. Outfitted with the strong Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it had superior climbing ability, diving speed, and maneuverability compared to the majority of German fighter planes. All of a sudden, the bombers were no longer isolated. Squadrons of Mustangs patrolled the skies in front, striking at interceptors before they could even get near. For the first time, the German Air Force was forced to engage in combat on unfair terms. The ones who were hunting had become the ones being hunted. American fighting strategies were also improving at a fast pace. Fighter escorts were no longer instructed to stay right next to the bombers. Instead, they had the liberty to fly ahead, proactively seek out enemy planes, and ensure clear airspace before the bombers got there. This aggressive tactic proved incredibly effective. The German pilots who once depended on the power of group attacks now had to deal with hordes of Mustangs waiting for them above. Even the most skilled veterans in the German Air Force started falling victim to coordinated fighter attacks from the Americans. The mental impact was immediate. German citizens, who were used to seeing their skies filled with black smoke and dogfights as German defenders attacked incoming bombers, now looked up and saw American fighters in control of the sky. The German Air Force, stretched thin across all fronts, could no longer defend its essential industrial region. Oil processing plants, factories for ball bearings, and aircraft building facilities were left undefended. Each successful bombing operation without significant casualties further demonstrated that Göring's claims of complete air control were false. The embarrassment grew for Göring. Reports landed on his desk describing German squadrons being wiped out in single battles. Once respected units came back with hardly any planes, and the German Air Force was losing not just aircraft, but more importantly, its most seasoned pilots. Training new pilots required many months, but they were being lost daily in combat. Meanwhile, the Americans had a never-ending supply of new pilots who were trained in large numbers at bases all over the United States. By the middle of 1944, the situation was desperate. The German Air Force was unable to stop the bombers, and their own fighters were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Göring privately told his close advisors that the situation was becoming unsustainable. In his own words, which were recorded by witnesses, he admitted that when he saw Mustangs protecting bombers over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. The arrogant Reich Marshal, who had once promised that German skies would never be violated, now had to accept the reality that America had not only arrived, but had completely changed the balance of power in the air. This wasn't just a shift in military power, but also a symbolic one. The German Air Force, once the pride of the Nazi war machine, was reduced to a defensive force desperately trying to survive. American air power had achieved something that Göring had always believed was impossible: total control over the skies of Germany. The long-range escorts accomplished more than simply protecting bombers. They shattered the idea of the German Air Force being unbeatable. The presence of the P-51 Mustang, along with other escort fighters, did not just change strategies. It guaranteed Germany's defeat in the air war. Göring had once laughed at the idea of American aviation being a threat. Now even he couldn't deny the truth. The United States had developed an air force that was not only unstoppable, but also incredibly precise. The skies of the Reich no longer belonged to Germany. By the summer of 1944, the consequences of America's relentless bombing campaign became brutally apparent. With sustained bomber casualty rates thanks to extended-range escort fighters, the United States Army Air Forces turned its attention to key elements of the German ability to wage war. Oil processing facilities, artificial fuel manufacturing sites, and transit systems were some of the initial elements to break apart due to the constant attacks. The admired air power of Germany could not even get their planes airborne because of the absence of fuel, and armored units on both the eastern and western war zones were rendered unable to move. The industrial core of Germany, previously an emblem of national pride, was gradually being destroyed from above. The Ruhr Valley, the hub of German steel and coal output, endured continued attacks. Railway lines were wrecked, bridges were demolished, and factories were inactive for several weeks after major bombings. During 1944 by itself, American planes released thousands of tons of bombs onto vital sites, transforming entire industrial areas into likenesses of the lunar surface, filled with holes and mangled metal. Urban centers such as Hamburg, Cologne, and Frankfurt turned into representations of wide-scale destruction. Manufacturing levels dropped so severely that entire divisions of the German economy came to a standstill. What Göring had at one time proclaimed as impossible was now a harsh reality seen on a regular basis. The operation of German industry was dictated by American aircraft. Perhaps the most serious setback resulted from the destruction of the German artificial fuel production capabilities. The Reich depended greatly on facilities that transformed coal into usable fuel because natural reserves of petroleum were lacking within its boundaries. These locations were intentionally attacked by American planes, and by the closing months of 1944, Germany's fuel output had decreased by about 90%. Air squadrons from Germany were unable to fly because there was not enough aviation fuel, and tank divisions throughout Europe reported shortages so extreme that tanks were left behind on the war zone. The once powerful mechanized military of Germany was disabled simply by the absence of fuel. a result that directly stemmed from the tactics employed by the American Air Forces. Apart from fuel, the German rail network was similarly devastated. Trains represented a vital element of the German conflict effort, moving soldiers, weapons, and provisions across the vast area of the Reich. Exact bombing of rail yards, intersections, and bridges brought movement to a standstill. Materials that once arrived at the battle lines in a matter of days now either took weeks or were never delivered at all. Entire divisions were left without ammunition and reinforcements, as factories were unable to do their work due to the fact that raw materials could no longer be transported to them. The precision displayed by American targeting made it obvious that it was not simply a matter of indiscriminate destruction. It was deliberate suffocation. The mental and emotional consequences for the German population were equally extensive. Ordinary people were living under constant threat, and morale deteriorated as warning sirens sounded every day. Workers, who were already exhausted from extended shifts in subterranean factories, would come back to their houses to find them reduced to debris. Göring, previously honored as the defender of German airspace, became an object of mockery. Regular citizens were openly making fun of his earlier claim that no enemy bomb would ever hit the Reich. By the latter part of 1944, the joke had turned bitter. Bombs were being dropped nearly every day, and nowhere in Germany could be considered truly secure. Even among the Nazi high command, Göring's credibility had been ruined. Hitler was furious at his failures, demanding reasons for the disintegration of Germany's air defense systems. Göring had at one time assured everyone that Germany's superior technology would hold the enemy back. However, even the most devoted members of his inner circle were now willing to say that America's production and military planning had completely overwhelmed them. The war machine of the German Empire was being choked, not only by defeats on the battlefield, but also by the constant wearing down of its essential manufacturing and supply systems. There was no escaping the reality. The aerial strength of the United States had managed to accomplish something that ground troops alone never could have. It fundamentally undermined Germany's capacity to continue waging war from within its own borders. The industrial facilities that had formerly been used to produce tanks, aircraft, and armaments were now nothing more than piles of rubble. The railway lines that had once been crucial for transporting soldiers and resources were completely unusable. The airspace, which had once been a source of pride and self-assurance for Göring, was now completely dominated by enemy forces. Each bombing raid represented more than just physical devastation. It served as a clear indication that the end of the German Empire was rapidly approaching. As the final months of 1944 approached, the widely held belief in the Luftwaffe's dominance had completely fallen apart. The situation was a personal embarrassment for Göring. He had established his reputation as the leader of the most formidable air force anywhere in the world. But now, day after day, American bombers were flying freely over German territory without facing any opposition. The arrogant boasts that had been so common in the early years of the conflict had now become regretful admissions made in private settings. Witnesses later recounted that Göring had admitted with unusual despondency that as soon as he noticed P-51 Mustangs escorting bomber formations all the way to Berlin, he realized that the war could not be won. This confession was not shared publicly. Göring could never summon the strength to inform the German population of the stark truth that American air power had shown itself to be unstoppable. However, in conversations with Hitler and other leading figures in the Nazi Party, his attitude shifted noticeably from one of bravado to one of resignation. He admitted that it made no difference how many aircraft the Luftwaffe managed to get airborne, or how many heroic actions German pilots carried out. The Americans would always come back with even greater force. The Luftwaffe had been completely drained of resources, including both equipment and personnel. Its top pilots, who had previously achieved incredible numbers of enemy aircraft shot down, were either dead or totally worn out, and their replacements consisted of poorly trained young men who were sent into battle with extremely limited flight experience. Göring's admission went beyond merely signifying his personal defeat. It was a representation of the growing feelings of hopelessness that were spreading throughout the entire Nazi leadership. Even Hitler, who had consistently demanded that the Luftwaffe protect the German Empire from destruction, was beginning to understand that Germany had lost control of its own airspace. Göring, who had previously been his trusted lieutenant, was now harshly criticized for his failures, accused of being incompetent, and increasingly marginalized when decisions were being made. The grandiose ideas of Luftwaffe supremacy that had once been central to Nazi propaganda now appeared absurd in light of the continuous destruction that was raining down on German cities. The importance of what Göring said in private lies in what it revealed. It was an acknowledgement that the United States had managed to achieve something that went far beyond simply winning a military victory. America had showcased a type of strength that encompassed manufacturing, strategic planning, and psychological impact all at the same time. The bombers did more than just destroy factories. They also shattered the widespread belief that Germany could not be defeated. The fighter planes did more than just clear the skies of enemy aircraft. They also eliminated any remaining confidence among the leaders of the Luftwaffe. By conceding the invincibility of American air power, Göring was essentially admitting the downfall of the very principle upon which the Reich had based its hopes for survival. The German populace witnessed this reality on a daily basis. Decimated factories stood as stark reminders of unfulfilled assurances. Grieving families mourned amidst the wreckage of cities that Göring had vowed would remain untouched. Even the most devoted party members could no longer maintain the illusion of the Luftwaffe's control over the skies. Göring, previously known for his flamboyant and boastful public displays, became increasingly withdrawn. His once formidable presence diminished, transforming him into a figure burdened by the failure of his own pronouncements. His admission extended beyond merely acknowledging the superiority of airplanes. It signified a recognition that America had mastered a novel dimension of warfare. The Luftwaffe, conceived for rapid campaigns and tactical superiority, proved unable to compete against an adversary that waged war through factories, logistics, and unwavering resolve. The United States had transformed the skies into an arena of sustained attrition, a competition in which only the side possessing limitless resources could emerge victorious. Germany, burdened by the Eastern Front and debilitated by the bombardment of its industries, lacked any prospect of success. Therefore, Göring's admission transcended a mere statement about aerial engagements. It represented the acknowledgement of a more profound truth. The power of America's Air Force mirrored the strength of the nation's industrial core, and once unleashed, it was unstoppable. For a man who had built his career on guarantees of aerial dominance, this realization was profoundly embittering. As the conflict neared its conclusion in 1945, the ramifications of American air supremacy became impossible to ignore. The formerly formidable Reich, which had swiftly conquered half of Europe through blitzkrieg tactics, now lay in devastation. Entire urban centers had been leveled, industrial complexes reduced to heaps of twisted debris, and the Luftwaffe, once the embodiment of Nazi strength, had been reduced to scattered squadrons incapable of challenging the overwhelming Allied aerial forces. Göring's Luftwaffe, initially regarded as impenetrable, no longer served as a protective barrier but rather as a fragmented relic. The Allies had secured aerial dominance not simply through individual aerial victories, but by consistently exerting pressure across every facet of German industry and logistical networks. Strategic bombing left crucial rail lines in ruins, bridges collapsed, and supply depots annihilated. Oil refineries, vital for sustaining both the Luftwaffe and Germany's mechanized army, were irreparably destroyed. Aircraft assembly facilities, once celebrated by Göring in the 1930s, fell silent, with their machinery buried beneath the rubble. The Americans, with their relentless stream of bombers and fighter planes, demonstrated that industrial air warfare could dictate the destiny of entire nations. For American military leaders, this dominance became the foundation of their overall strategy. By the time of D-Day in June 1944, Allied troops landed in Normandy shielded by a protective umbrella of air support. German divisions, previously feared for their speed and precision, were rendered ineffective by persistent aerial attacks. Convoys were decimated on open roads, armored units incinerated on highways, and retreating forces subjected to aerial bombardment. The Luftwaffe was largely reduced to a helpless spectator, its surviving aircraft easily destroyed by P-51 Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Göring's previous claims about the invincibility of German airspace now appeared tragically absurd. The world after the war would deeply consider these experiences. The might of American air forces had fundamentally changed not only the war's results, but also the very foundations of contemporary military strategy. The concept that using strategic bombing could cripple an opponent's economy and weaken their resolve became a core tenet for many years into the future. The enormous bomber formations, supported by long-range fighter escorts, had demonstrated that dominating the airspace was no longer a choice. It was crucial. Countries around the globe carefully examined the U.S. approach, realizing that future conflicts would be determined, not only on land or sea, but also in the immense spaces above. For Germany, the aftermath was deeply humiliating. The Reich, which had previously ridiculed America as feeble and unable to wage significant war, had been forced into submission by the very power it had underestimated. Göring, imprisoned following the war, bore the painful realization that his assurances had crumbled under the overwhelming power of American manufacturing. He had declared to the German population that their skies would remain unbreached. However, by the war's conclusion, every city had experienced the devastating impact of Allied bombing raids. His personal acknowledgement that America's air capabilities were insurmountable became a suitable ending to the Luftwaffe's demise. The narrative of America's ascent in aerial warfare was more than just a chronicle of aircraft and engagements. It illustrated how a democratic nation, often dismissed as weak and unprepared, effectively mobilized its industries, its workforce, and its collective determination to unleash a force that overwhelmed one of history's most formidable military organizations. Even Göring, the creator of the Luftwaffe, could not refute it. America had not merely engaged Germany in aerial combat, it had completely reinvented the concept of air power.